Good afternoon. My name is Soren Brothers, and I'm the Alan and Elaine Schiff Curator of Climate Change. I'm delighted that you could join us for today's Curator Conversation, a digital program that explores themes and subjects from ROM collections alongside industry professionals. I would like to take this opportunity to thank TD for their ongoing support of this program. I'd also like to begin by acknowledging that the ROM sits on what has been the ancestral lands of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Anishinaabeg Nation, including the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, since time immemorial to today. Today's program is in support of our current exhibition, Great Whales, Up Close and Personal, which is open now until the 26th of June, 2022. We would like to acknowledge the support of Nita and Don Reed and family, Newfoundland and Labrador, and the Royal Exhibition Circle donors in making this exhibition possible. I would also like to thank our partners at OceanWise Seafood for participating in the program. OceanWise is a globally focused conservation organization on a mission to protect and restore the world's oceans. Through research, education, direct action, conservation, and field projects, they empower communities to take action for ocean health. Please join me in welcoming OceanWise Seafood Ambassador Samantha Renshaw to today's program. Thanks, Samantha, for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I'll also just start by saying that I'm located in Halifax and to acknowledge that this is in Mi'kmaq, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people.
Thank you, Samantha. We will begin with a short discussion around OceanWise's initiatives and how they strive to inspire each and every one of us to make small changes to support healthy and sustainable oceans. During the program, please submit your thoughts via the Q&A feature on the screen, and we'll have some time at the end to answer your questions. So please join me now in welcoming Samantha Renshaw to the conversation. And Samantha, I just wanted to start with kind of a general question. Why is it important for someone, say, living in Winnipeg or Toronto to be thinking about the ocean?
That's a great question, and I think it's really relevant when we consider that OceanWise is first and foremost a Canadian establishment. We are looking at a global perspective, but we have partners in our business that are in 3,000 locations across our country. So fisheries are not just exclusive to people on the coasts. We have aquaculture facilities and restaurants that sell fishing products all over the place. So when we consider that fisheries and aquaculture provide seafood protein to more than 20% of people globally, why does that matter for us? And so we may have the luxury of not consuming seafood, but that's not always the case for people who live in coastal communities and are reliant on seafood for their main source of food security or maybe their livelihoods. And so when we talk about sustainable seafood, we want to make sure that we're making decisions that allow us to continue harvesting seafood, not just for next year or the year after, but for 20 years, entire generations, and for as long as the ocean will be around for us to harvest resources from. So it just means that when you decide to get a plate of salmon in Toronto, it probably came from somewhere across the world, and we're really impacting the globalization of our community when we choose seafood in general, unless we know exactly where it's coming from or if it came from next door. So it's really something at OceanWise that we try and distill down into very simple choices and simple language so people can be aware of their choices.
Makes sense. And you use the term sustainable seafood there. So what is sustainable seafood, and how does that link with the OceanWise sustainable seafood program?
Yeah, so OceanWise was established back in 2005, so almost 20 years ago, as a really simple way for consumers to choose between something that might be sustainable and something that might be less sustainable. So we run a binary system, and it's either OceanWise recommended or not recommended. And what goes into these recommendations is where we get a little bit complicated in the conversation of sustainable seafood. It depends on the gear that's used to harvest fish, or it depends on the location of the aquaculture facility, the stock, the location, the harvest method, all these things. And so we really boil it down into three pillars of sustainable seafood. The first being healthy and resilient populations. So for wild fisheries, this means that we have a stock that is not being taken out of the ocean at a rate that it can't reproduce itself naturally. So that's the first piece. So are we fishing at a level that allows the fish to be there next year and the year after? The second piece is management and regulations. So is the fisheries management that's in place really going at the target that we want? So are we making sure that the regulations mean we're fishing below this maximum line, or right close to it, so that we have good economics and good ecosystem sustainability? And then what is the enforcement and the monitoring like? So do we have enough scientific data being produced from these fisheries in order to kind of pick out those numbers, or make sure that what we did last year is going to continue next year, or maybe we need to tweak it? So the second piece is effective adaptive management. And then the final one is where we get a little bit more tricky and into a lot more specifics on ecosystem impact. So what is the impact of our fishing on habitats or aquaculture on the local ecosystem? So for this, it might mean something like reducing our impact with endangered, threatened, or protected species. So for ocean-wise, anything that we recommend can't have any sort of negative interaction on endangered species. So if we're worried about, let's say, North Atlantic right whales and lobster fishing, we don't recommend any sort of interaction that might put these species at risk. Another piece of that is habitat. So for example, in aquaculture, we really look at what sort of impact an open net pen system might have on local ecosystems. So is there a lot of disease that's being leaked into the natural environment? Are we changing the coastline a lot in order to construct these aquaculture facilities? Is there a lot of escapes that are happening and potentially inducing invasive species into the natural ecosystem? All of these things go into our recommendations, and that is my job, is to put all that into numbers and make sure that we come to an agreement at the end of, okay, this is right now, based on the information we have, the best choice. And so that's why OceanWise is in the space that it's in, to make all of that my job to worry about and not the consumers.
Oh, that makes sense. And thinking about, just kind of from a personal standpoint, I feel like, just in conversations, a lot of people talk about, thinking even about farmed versus wild salmon, for instance, as a kind of a moral decision that they have to make when they're in the grocery store. What are your thoughts on choosing between those? Or is there an official OceanWise stance on which is better?
Yeah, so for us, it comes down to best practice. So we can't say that based on our recommendations, something is 100% not having any impact on the environment. We go with best practice, and we have our cutoff line. And unfortunately, it means a lot of both aquaculture and wild fisheries are not recommended by us. The best option that you can make, and is reflected in our recommendations, is from recirculating aquaculture systems. So these are land-based salmon aquaculture, and it basically means that everything is contained in a land-based form, and so nothing is escaping into the environment. The wastewater is really well controlled. And then from there, if that's not an available option, anything local is our recommendation if it's available to you. But unfortunately, a lot of salmon is not available locally, and a lot of the salmon that we recommend is from Alaska and gets shipped to China, is just the bottom line. So a lot of the salmon that we recommend that's wild is coho and Chinook salmon from either Alaska or Russia. So if you know that that's an option, it's a good one. Farmed salmon is probably, as long as it's on land, is also your best choice versus in the water. And it's really simple from our website. If you just go on, you can Google, if you're staring at a menu, you're not sure if it's OceanWise, you can Google Chinook salmon, and it'll come up with all of our recommendations. And you can try and maybe ask a few questions to either your server or your fishmonger and ask where things came from in order to kind of paint a better picture. But yeah, these are some of the hurdles we have to jump over in order to make informed decisions.
Okay, well, and that links, I was going to ask you what people would do in terms of at a restaurant or at the grocery store. So is there anything else other than what you were just suggesting, or is that kind of the main approach that you'd recommend for knowing that people are buying sustainably in terms of their daily habits?
So how our system works is I have it's this side. Our logo right here is our OceanWise logo. And this is sort of the core of our seafood program, is that if this logo is on a product or on a menu, it is OceanWise recommended. If it's not there, it doesn't mean it's not recommended. It might just mean we haven't assessed it yet. And you can go to our website, or we work with other seafood programs, such as the Seafood Watch program out of the Monterey Bay Aquarium. They have more of a red, yellow, green light system that you can check on. You can also look and see other seafood certification logos, like the Marine Stewardship Council is also a good way to judge just at a glance if something is sustainable or not. One thing that we don't consider is carbon in our recommendations, unfortunately. That's a whole other ball game, which I'm sure you can appreciate. But there are carbon calculators that you can also find online that do a good job of showing you what your carbon footprint might be from choosing a certain seafood as well. So these are all tools in the tool belt to have when you're going out to, oh yeah, this is our seafood program map. So you can find all our partners on the website and click around and see, this is just showing you a snapshot of Toronto, all the things that might be around the ROM to access sustainable seafood from.
That's great. And yeah, you were touching on carbon there. I mean, as the curator of climate change, I'm curious in your thoughts on how fisheries relate to climate change.
So we sort of get a double-edged sword when we talk about fisheries and climate change. There's both the impact of fisheries on climate change and then sort of the impact of climate change on fisheries. So one of the big ones in terms of fisheries having an impact on climate change is the fact that our seafood has to be flown around the globe if you're not consuming local products. And that just comes with its own carbon footprint, which is built into that carbon calculator. But it's also really difficult to quantify what the impact is when we consider that some fisheries, like bottom trawls, for example, are dredging up bits of the ocean and might be disturbing some sensitive habitat, releasing carbon into the water and then into our atmosphere, and really having an impact that way. And then on the flip side, the fact that carbon and climate change is really shifting the distribution of species, having almost an unknown effect. Like we're not sure whether fisheries are going to be increasing in productivity in places like the Arctic and decreasing in productivity around like coral reef structures. So we're sort of faced with a little double-edged sword when it comes to climate and the ocean. So it depends on what way you want to go with thinking about these issues.
Do you think just personally that that's going to be kind of a future area that more and more sustainable fishing is going to be focusing on, is that double-edged sword?
Absolutely. And that's our hope as well. I think in my ideal world, we would include a carbon measure in our seafood recommendations. Unfortunately, the data is not available for us to do this in any way that's streamlined and doesn't take the capacity of our entire team. We would need a separate climate section of our science team to work on this. But it is my hope that we are going to move forward into building that into our recommendations at some point. That would be blue sky thinking.
It's really exciting. Another thing that I thought was kind of neat or exciting, looking at your website, the OceanWise website, it talks about this new word for me, seaforestation. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what that was and how that related maybe to climate change, the links that were mentioned there.
Yeah, so seaforestation is its own branch of OceanWise, and it's in its infancy still. And it's really exciting work. So seaforestation is essentially trying to build up these underwater forests. So we consider the rainforests and our natural forests on land as being these massive sources of oxygen and carbon sequestration. But what maybe we aren't as familiar with as a public or children in school is that the oceans also have these massive forests. And so we can see on the screen, these are kelp forests. And so these structures and kelp grow really fast and really tall. They can be like up to 45 meters tall and grow by almost a ruler length, 30 centimeters every day. And they have just an amazing ability to capture carbon and store it in their tissues and really sequester it out of the environment. But what happens is sometimes in areas along the coastline is that these forests get degraded, and it's not just kelp, it could be seaweeds and all sorts of other things where there are nice fish nurseries and all this wonderful life is happening. And so seaforestation is the process of building up these forests again. So it can happen by planting little seedlings, just like you would plant in a forest, or it can happen by kind of spreading out the little seedlings and just hoping something grows in its natural habitat. And we just get massive benefits from these kelp forests, and not to mention that they're beautiful. But it can also help produce kelp products and seaweed products that are already being harvested. And so there's the pillar of seaforestation that's reestablishing these forests, and then the one that is also for harvest of the kelp as well.
Okay, so there's two elements of Ocean Wise's link with sea forest, with the kelp forest preservation.
Yeah, and so we as the seafood team are obviously more involved on the kelp production side, and in our recommendations, kelp are like 100% across the board recommended for us in most cases. But seaforestation is its own section now of Ocean Wise, so there should be a link that we can pop in the chat to their website as well if anyone's curious and learning more. It's very, very exciting work.
That's cool. I've always loved seeing these kelp forest pictures. I mean, it looks like such amazing environments. And another thing that I feel comes up a lot these days is people talk about plastics, and the effect of plastic waste on the ocean. And you have these kind of gyres where plastics are accumulating on the surface. I was wondering if there was a link with Ocean Wise in terms of thinking about the effects of plastic on seafood or ocean health in general.
Yeah, so Ocean Wise again has a plastics reduction program, which is wonderful, and we link very closely with our seafood team. When we think about plastics and seafood in particular, I think everyone's seen maybe that really fearful image of a credit card next to a fish saying that could be how much plastic you're consuming, which is maybe a little bit fear-mongering, but there have been studies that have shown almost every sample of seafood analyzed has contained at least a fraction of microplastics in the tissues, which means that if the oysters or the squid that we're consuming has microplastics in it, we are also consuming those microplastics. I'm less familiar with the impact that might have on humans in the long run, and I think that's still an area of research that's up and coming. But the problem is that when we don't mitigate our plastic at the source, it gets into our waterways or it gets into our landfills, and then it breaks down not in the way that organics break down, but as microplastics. So when you hold a really old piece of plastic and it disintegrates into your hands a little bit and it's got all these little dust pieces, those are little microplastics, and they're really hard to get out of the ocean. And so that's what's ending up in our food chain. And so the little fish eats the little microplastics, the bigger fish eats the smaller fish with all the microplastics, and it becomes this bioaccumulation of plastic in these systems. So what Ocean Wise Plastics Program is trying to do is, on top of the research for all of this, is stop it at the source. And so similar to our seafood program, the plastics reduction program works with local businesses that are trying to reduce their single-use plastics. So we know that 83% of the plastic that ends up in our ocean is from typically everyday disposable goods. So a lot of plastic bottles, plastic bags, cutlery, a lot of things that end up in our restaurant industry or in the seafood supply industry. And so similar in the way that restaurants can be seafood certified, they can be plastics partner. And then we know that even in both cases that this restaurant or this place, this supplier is really trying its best to reduce its impact on the environment at large. And we have links to the plastics program as well. You can get involved with ocean cleanups and shoreline cleanups, which are really fun. They happen all over Canada. So it's a really great initiative as well.
Awesome, thank you. And we are thinking a lot about whales these days at the ROM, given the Great Whales exhibit. I was wondering if you had any thoughts from Ocean Wise's perspective on protecting whales and what benefits are there through this kind of program, sustainable fisheries.
So whales, I mean, apart from being our near and dear, our beautiful whales, they really provide the ocean with a lot of ecosystem benefits, even on top of fisheries regulation in terms of being predators in some cases, if you consider killer whales and orcas, and really thinking that their prey is being impacted when we take their salmon out of the the ocean, then that's less predators for them to eat. And that's one aspect of it. That is a really big issue on the west coast of Canada. And so it's important that we consider our seafood choices when it comes to protecting whales in that way. We also consider the way of the gear that we use in fishing impacting whales. So if we go to the opposite coast on the east coast, a lot of whales like the North Atlantic right whale are being entangled in discarded fishing gear, which we call ghost gear. So these, when gear gets away from certain fisheries, it continues to fish in a lot of cases, and it can entangle whales and damage their populations in a pretty significant way. And we really need these whales in a bigger context in order to maintain our ocean ecosystem and the health of our oceans at large. So I don't know how familiar everyone is with the fact that whale poop and whale waste is a really good fertilizer for the ocean. And in that way, they kind of create these big followings of life and these big areas where production is just so abundant because these whales are able to consume enough food for themselves, and then they produce such great benefits all the way down the food chain for their ecosystem. So that's not even to touch on the carbon sequestration of whales. It's just so incredible what these massive animals and how important they are in our environments.
Yeah, I've just
I
been
love
reading.
whales.
Yeah, no, me too. I've been reading about it more and more since being here too. And just, I mean, it's amazing. You know, we think about carbon sequestration of planting forests and doing all these things, but whales do so much, and it's on a scale it's just massive that it's hard to really kind of fathom.
Yeah, it's like a tree is a certain pounds of carbon every hour, and a whale is like tons and tons and tons of carbon that they gather every hour. It's just almost unmeasurable. It's incredible.
Yeah. No, thank you so much. I have one more question, and it kind of loops back to what you were saying earlier, but just thinking about, you know, why it's important to think about sustainable fisheries. I was wondering if you could just kind of summarize, just kind of loop back, and what would be, you think, are like, I don't know, the few key points of why it's important for people to be thinking about buying sustainable seafood?
I think the knowledge that you have options and you have choice is a really powerful one for consumers to decide that there are all sorts of ways that you can contribute to ocean sustainability and seafood sustainability in general. So it might not even be ocean wise. It might be that you're just considering the fact that you know that you could have perch in Toronto that was caught locally versus having scallops from the East Coast. And so it's really just important to consider the impact that we each and every one of us have in something as simple as choosing what to have for dinner, what it will do to the global environment, not just for tomorrow, but for our kids tomorrow and our future for generations to come. So that's our hope at Oceanwise, to not only help Canadians make these informed decisions, but eventually make these decisions more accessible to people all over the world.
That's great. So I want to thank you, Samantha, for joining us in this program. And I hope everyone watching this is going to be able to visit the ROM's special exhibitions, including great whales up close and personal, now that the ROM is reopened to the public. And Samantha and I are going to answer some of your questions for the next few minutes. And as a reminder, questions can be submitted via the Q&A feature on your screen. So I am going to open that up now and start grilling you. So the first question here, Samantha, is from Elka Enola: is any fish farming or farm fishing acceptable, or is any specifically recommended?
Yeah, and so the answer quite simply is yes. There are definitely options where farmed fish is completely acceptable. And like I kind of touched on earlier, the best options that we recommend are any land-based farms that are producing things in closed systems. So where the wastewater is treated just like it's treated coming from your house. And so none of the chemicals that are used in feed or in like any disease that might occur in open net pens are being flushed out into the ocean. So that's our biggest recommendations are in recirculating systems. And there are some on the east coast of Canada that are producing Atlantic salmon in a very sustainable way. So it's a good option if you're worried to check into those and just kind of get rid of the fear of either farmed or wild in general, is to pick more land-based options.
Thanks. And Sue asked, does sustainability factor in working conditions? So how can we tell in the grocery store whether the product uses slave labor?
This is also a very, very good question, and something that currently our recommendations don't account for, but something just like the carbon footprint factor that we are looking into building into our recommendations. It gets tricky. It's very difficult when a lot of these things are happening, particularly when it comes to human rights, very under the table. We might not always have the best information or the true picture of what's happening. So there are other like livelihoods, sustainability, human rights groups that do look at the seafood trade. Right now, ours do not, but we are hoping to integrate those in the future.
Interesting. And Irma Benner has asked, why aren't you recommending salmon from British Columbia?
So in a lot of cases, the issue with salmon in British Columbia is that they have tried to farm, and I assume we're talking about, like, we can touch on wild and farm, but there have been Atlantic salmon tried to be farmed in BC, and a lot of times if escapes happen, this is a danger to the wild populations of BC salmon. It hasn't established a population of invasive Atlantic salmon in BC as of now, but a lot of the risk that it comes with that is the disease infiltrating local populations. And again, it comes down to that the populations are not sustainable for the ecosystem at large. So when we consider that we need to feed all of the orcas and everything as well, it's just not at a level of abundance that we can recommend at this time.
And an anonymous attendee has asked, what's the difference between OceanWise and the Marine Stewardship Council?
That's a great question, because OceanWise is a recommendation system and the Marine Stewardship Council is a certification system. So they have a much more rigid structure to follow and a much more industry-centric mandate. So we use the Marine Stewardship Council to inform our recommendations, but their process is a little bit different, where it goes through many more evaluations or audits, and ours is a little bit more flexible, so we can look at these and really make a decision on our own. We also benchmarked the Marine Stewardship Council, so some of the things that our Marine Stewardship Council certified are not OceanWise recommended, just based on what their criteria is and what our criteria is. So we get away with a little bit more flexibility by not being a certification, but versus recommendation.
Alex Ramsey has asked, is there consideration in the research for species at risk, like how certain traps from specific fisheries impact North Atlantic right whale survival?
Yes, absolutely. So this is one of the reasons that we don't recommend lobster from Atlantic Canada, is a lot to do with the entanglement of North Atlantic right whales in a lot of escaped lobster traps. There are some really cool innovations happening with ropeless lobster traps. Unfortunately, our recommendations don't reflect those because they're not widespread in the fishery currently, but it's hopeful that in the next little while, once these adapted fishing practices are uptaken in more broadly, that we can start to recommend more Canadian Atlantic lobster. But we do not consider any recommendation as OceanWise if it has any interaction with an at-risk species. So this means that it could be something that's listed as vulnerable or threatened by the IUCN, so the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, or it could be something that is more Canadian specific. So it could be SARA listed, so the Species at Risk Act under the Canadian federal government. So we kind of dip into all the different possible ways that species are considered at risk, and we do not recommend any of those.
Interesting. And Grace C has asked, hello, what are your thoughts on a plant-based diet, or at least reducing seafood or fish intake by considering other plant-friendly options? Thank you.
I think that's a wonderful solution, and it is totally an option that we promote. So if you have the option, or you choose to eliminate or reduce seafood from your diet as much as you want or you are able, then that's definitely a sustainable option. The problem becomes when it is not the only solution. So it is not reasonable or logical to ask everyone to stop consuming seafood. The ocean provides plenty resource for communities all over the world that don't have the plant-based option. So what can we do to maintain sustainability at large if that's not always a solution for people? Seafood can be a really cheap source of protein. It can be a really healthy source of protein. So some people might need it in their diets or want it in their diets. And so what are we doing to ensure that those people have access to the best options? But if you want to choose plant-based solutions, there are so many kelp and seaweed options that are based or made into plant-based options. It's really incredible. So that's also something that we're hoping to explore in the future is the movement towards alternative seafood.
I lived in Japan just incidentally about 15 years ago, and that was the first time that I started eating a lot of seafood and kelp, and I loved kelp. I thought it was so delicious. I had no idea.
It's awesome.
Yeah.
In Atlantic Canada, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia, they have dulse, which is like basically served as chips in little bags. It's just like nice and salty, like organically salty, and it's awesome. It's really great little snack.
That's great. Mark Peck has asked, are you working with big grocery store chains to better promote sustainable seafood?
Very plainly, absolutely. We work with Sobeys, which is probably one of our largest partners, and they are really integrated with us in the planning from a grocery and retail perspective in how to promote ocean-wise products and how to better push for sustainability from a retailer perspective. So I'm not sure if I mentioned across Canada, we have 3,000 different suppliers or different restaurateurs in all sorts of different ways, shapes, and forms. And yeah, Sobeys is our biggest one, and hopefully we can get more on board as we continue to grow.
Great. And another anonymous attendee has asked, I'm curious to know where fish oil supplements fit into the monitoring of sustainable seafood products.
So this is a really interesting one because it's something that toes the line between what we recommend or dip into in recommendations versus where we draw the line. We don't currently have any recommendations on supplements unless the supplier has gone so far as to describe to us where exactly what fish it's coming from or what exactly like what fish is going into the production of these fish oils. And so we don't currently have any of those, but it is, again, into the cosmetic and the alternative seafood space, something that is not impossible to come up in our recommendations in the future.
Richard Witham has asked, do you evaluate the amount of antibiotics used in fish farms? And do not all farmed fish require large amounts of antibiotics to keep diseases in check?
Yes, we do. We consider for aquaculture and specifically open net pen aquaculture, there are lots of different criteria that we look at. So disease being one of them and antibiotics being one of them, what is eventually ending up into the water supply. And so it's true that it depends on how much disease resistance is built into the population. I used to work in a pathobiology lab, and the whole goal was to develop fish strands and aquaculture setups basically that reduce the amount of disease without the need for antibiotics. And so there's a lot of work that is continuing in this space from a research perspective. And it's something that we consider, but again, it's difficult and it has to be done on a case-by-case basis, what is recommended and what is not.
Grace C has asked, how would we determine land versus aqua fish farms when it is not wild? But these are not on labels in 99% when asking at grocery stores or especially restaurants. This seems to be an unknown.
The answer to this question is push the government to increase traceability standards. So this is a huge problem that the seafood industry in general runs into, is that the legal floor for traceability standards in our seafood is very low. So the amount of information that we need to determine where something is coming from is not always being collected, and it makes our recommendation process quite difficult. And so the only solution for this moving forward is, and the way that producers and consumers are able to really say on their own without our help whether something is sustainable, is to make sure that from the farm, from the boat to the plate, we know exactly where it's been, what the species is. All of these things are not always mandated, and it becomes very difficult to discern what might be ending up on your plate. There is a huge issue of seafood mislabeling all over the globe, and Canada included. And so this is something that we try and tackle. It is less so built into our recommendations, but the best you can do is also the answer for that question, as good as you can try.
Well, and that links in nicely to this next question by Min, which is, what is being done to address mislabeling of seafood? My understanding is that it happens a lot and affects our ability to make the right choice when we shop.
So our partners get audited for what they tell us they have in their stores. So we go through and our accounts team make sure that exactly where they're getting their food from is in our system as being recommended, not recommended. They know the suppliers that they're getting it from. The suppliers know the producers they're getting it from. And so we do our best to ensure that the supply chain is transparent in our recommendations, and specifically for our logo use. However, if you were to Google or search on our OceanWise website for Atlantic salmon, for example, you sitting in a restaurant in, let's say, Florida, might not know, if it's not OceanWise recommended, that is exactly what and where your seafood is coming from. So this, again, yes, goes back to mislabeling. And there's a huge issue and a huge problem of traceability. And there are trying to be safeguards against this. QR codes are a big one. We've all become more familiar with QR codes over the last 2 years. So it's a hope that this can be upheld in the seafood industry as well. It's work that OceanWise isn't directly connected to. But yes, it is an issue, and it's trying to be tackled. We need to push for better labeling mandates. Absolutely.
Great. Anonymous attendee has asked, where does the funding come from for OceanWise, and how do you remain arm's length from your funders? So
this is a good question as well. And this goes back to, as much as we ask for transparency, we should be giving transparency. So partners do have to pay to be a part of OceanWise. However, we audit them and we really lean on our numbers. And so if the seafood that they are providing does not fall within our recommended status, they cannot put OceanWise on their brand, and they will no longer be one of our partners to be involved in the program. And it's really as simple as that. They're able to change and able to be involved as much as they wish. And so we do get donations from things like Sobeys and other organizations, but it doesn't influence our recommendations because we kind of go science towards the industry rather than from industry back towards science. Although if there is a market demand for certain seafoods, we try and do our best to come up with recommendations for those just based on popularity. The other way that we are funded is through grants. And I'm not sure if everyone's familiar that OceanWise used to be a partner of the Vancouver Aquarium. That's where it was born out of. And then it is separated from the aquarium. As of 2017, it became its own NGO, but now it's fully separate from the aquarium. So we're going through a bit of a branding transition, but there used to be funding that came from there and from different grants that we apply to. That's also part of my job on the science team, is trying to get the money to continue doing our research.
And another anonymous attendee has asked, how does OceanWise come up with its recommendations?
So there's a few ways that we come to our final decision. It's based on the best scientific information available. So this could be stock assessments from governments or from regional fisheries bodies. It could be primary literature published by academics. And we also benchmark our standards and recommendations to the Seafood Watch out of the Monterey Bay Aquarium and then Marine Stewardship Council. And so we sort of take their numbers and match it to our criteria. And so we can say, okay, if something is recommended fully by as a good alternative for Seafood Watch, then we know that it's probably pretty close to being recommended for us. We do a little bit of digging about where their scores are coming from, and then we match it to our criteria and we can give a final yes or no. And then the same thing, it works similarly with the Marine Stewardship Council, that we just go through and we dig into their actual numbers and then we match it to ours. So we can kind of piggyback off of some of the other certifications, and it just makes our job a little bit easier and gives us more recommendations. And then when we don't have those to kind of tie into, then we can come up with our own recommendations through reports and through our criteria.
Very interesting. And Bernice Pinnell has asked, does organic farming automatically mean it would pass your standards?
Great question. It does not. So organic and sustainable are not interchangeable words. Organic typically refers to things like no pesticides or no chemical use, those sorts of things. It doesn't necessarily mean that typically in aquaculture that they're not using fish food that's been treated or fish food. I'm not sure how familiar people are with aquaculture, but for example, it takes a lot of fish feed to feed salmon in aquaculture pens. So if you're using fish that are at low levels to feed your salmon and you're harvesting those fish from the wild to put into fish feed to then feed your captive salmon, that's not a sustainable practice in our mind. And so it could be organic. You could be using completely chemical-free, completely antibiotic-free, disease resistance, but what you're doing is not necessarily sustainable from an ecological perspective when you consider where the source of your food for these fish are coming from. And that's just one example. So we do use some organic standards to help benchmark, but it does not mean that it passes 100% of the time.
Super interesting. Well, thank you. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Samantha, and thank you for Oceanwise Seafood for sharing their expertise and experience today. We hope to see you again for our next digital program, and details of all upcoming ROM at Home online programs can be found on the ROM's website and our social media channels.